Barron Trump sat quietly under the blinding studio lights, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the media frenzy that had always defined his family. Anderson Cooper, the seasoned journalist, leaned in with a sly smile, ready to unravel the enigmatic Trump heir. But what happened next would flip the entire interview on its head and leave the world rethinking the power of silence. Before we dive into the full story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. If you love gripping tales like this, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we've got another incredible story waiting for you. Barron Trump had always lived in the shadows, a silent figure in the background of his family's public life. While the rest of his relatives thrived in the spotlight, feeding off the media's constant attention, Barron had mastered the art of remaining unseen. He moved like a ghost, his presence barely noticed, but his silence spoke volumes. The world saw him as the enigmatic youngest son of former President Donald Trump. No interviews, no outbursts, no social media feuds, just a quiet, almost mysterious figure drifting in and out of history's frame. But that night, under the blinding studio lights of a live television broadcast, everything changed. The interview was supposed to be routine, just another appearance on Anderson Cooper's primetime news show. But for Barron, it was anything but ordinary. The invitation alone had raised eyebrows. Why him, and why now? Some believe Barron was finally ready to step into the political spotlight, prepared to break his silence. Others thought it was a fluff piece, a rare glimpse into the life of the Trump heir, who had remained so elusive for so long. But what started as a simple conversation about the next generation of political legacies quickly spiraled into something no one expected. Anderson Cooper, the seasoned journalist known for his sharp questions and relentless probing, invited Barron into the lion's den. The air in the studio was thick with anticipation, and the audience waited in tense silence. Anderson, ever the provocateur, leaned forward in his chair, his piercing blue eyes narrowing with a calculated smile. He was a master at pushing his guests to the edge, and tonight he was going to test Barron in ways no one had before. "So, Barron," Anderson began, his voice smooth but tinged with something sharper, "let's talk about your mother, Melania Trump." His words hung in the air, and the audience shifted, sensing the shift in tone. She's often seen, rarely heard, a first lady wrapped in elegance, but not exactly known for speaking out. Do you think silence is a virtue, or is it just convenient? The room seemed to hold its breath. A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd, some chuckling, others exchanging knowing glances. It was classic Anderson Cooper, poking at the most sensitive spots, testing the boundaries. Most guests would have stumbled, laughed awkwardly, or deflected the question. That's what the audience expected from Barron. A moment of unease, of hesitation. But Barron Trump was not like the others. The young man, tall and composed, sat perfectly still, his face unreadable. Barron's gaze locked onto Anderson's, his eyes steady and unflinching. The air in the room tightened, the tension palpable, as though something electric was building between the two men. The studio felt smaller, the lights blindingly bright, and for the first time in his life, Barron Trump opened his mouth. His voice, low and calm, cut through the silence. "Silence," he began, his words measured, "is not a weakness. It is not a choice of convenience. It is a strategy." The audience was stunned. No one had ever heard him speak with such conviction, and certainly not about his mother. Anderson Cooper, who had spent years dismantling public figures with his relentless questioning, felt a shift in the air. This was not going to be like any interview he had conducted before. Barron was different. There was something unsettling in his quiet strength, a calmness that made Anderson question the carefully constructed narrative he had set up. Anderson, ever the professional, pressed on. "Melania Trump has been a fascinating figure in the public eye," he said, his voice smooth as he leaned forward. "Always present, yet never fully engaged. A first lady who was more about her image than her voice, and yet, in a time when women are fighting harder than ever to be heard, she chose silence." Doesn't that strike you as odd? The audience was on edge, some shifting in their seats, others nodding in agreement. Anderson's words were designed to provoke, to create a story. But Barron remained steadfast, unmoved by the taunts. "It's easy to criticize silence," Barron replied, "but sometimes it's the most powerful form of resistance. The world is loud, filled with noise, and sometimes silence speaks louder than words ever could. Anderson's eyes widened slightly, sensing a deeper complexity in Barron than he had anticipated. He had expected a moment of discomfort, a crack in Barron's facade. Instead, he was faced with a calm, composed young man who had just thrown the narrative Anderson had constructed out the window. "Do you think your mother was simply comfortable being a symbol?" Anderson pressed, trying to regain control of the conversation. In a time when women are pushing for equality, pushing for change, Melania Trump remained silent. Was she content to be a symbol of beauty and grace without using her position for anything more? But Barron for the first time smiled, a slow, knowing smile that seemed to hold all the weight of the years he had spent in the shadows. "Maybe she didn't need to be anything more," he said. "Maybe her silence was a form of strength, a refusal to play the game the way the world wanted her to. Perhaps she chose not to fight the noise, but to rise above it." The room fell silent. Anderson Cooper, the master of dismantling figures with nothing but words, found himself caught off guard. Barron Trump had done something no one had expected. He had turned the tables on the interview, challenging the very narrative Anderson had been crafting. The high-powered questions, the sharp critiques, all fell away in the face of Barron's unshakable calm. The high-stakes interview that had started with a simple question about political legacies had become something much more, a battle of wills, a quiet confrontation between two powerful figures, one determined to push, the other refusing to bend. And in that moment, Barron Trump proved something far greater than any words could capture. Sometimes silence is the loudest voice in the room. Anderson Cooper continued his line of questioning, pushing deeper into Barron's composure. "Silence can be powerful, but at some point, don't you think you need to speak up, be seen, not just heard?" Anderson's eyes gleamed with the expectation of an uncomfortable response. He was waiting for Barron to flinch, to show any sign of weakness, any indication that the quiet, composed young man across from him could be rattled. But Barron Trump remained unfazed. He didn't twitch in his seat. There was no discomfort in his posture, no hint of the angst Anderson might have hoped to provoke. Instead, Barron sat there like a statue, his expression as unreadable as ever, his gaze fixed on Anderson with an intensity that made the very air between them feel charged. And then, with the studio buzzing with tension, Barron Trump did the unthinkable. He spoke, and what he said would change the entire dynamic of the interview. The room fell into a silence so thick it felt almost suffocating. Anderson leaned back slightly, his piercing blue eyes never leaving Barron. But this time, the words he was expecting never came. Instead of a nervous chuckle, a deflective comment, or a simple protest, Barron's voice cut through the silence with a calm, deliberate strength. "You talk about my mother like she's just another headline," Barron said, his tone unwavering yet laced with a quiet power that seemed to ripple through the air. "Like she's a symbol, a caricature to be dissected under these studio lights. But let me remind you, she's a person, a human being with thoughts, feelings, and a strength that most people will never understand." The audience, who had been on the edge of their seats, now sat frozen, caught between shock and curiosity. Barron's words hung in the air, each one heavier than the last. Anderson Cooper, who had spent decades grilling presidents, exposing scandals, and making even the most powerful figures flinch, found himself on the receiving end of something far more potent than he had expected. Barron continued, his voice never rising, yet each word seemed to carry the weight of years of silence. "She spent years being mocked, criticized, belittled by people who have never met her, people who know nothing about what she's been through." The words seemed to hang in the air, a direct challenge to Anderson's narrative and to the very foundations of how the media had portrayed Melania Trump. "You call her silent, but did it ever occur to you that silence can be a choice?" Barron's eyes never wavered as he met Anderson's gaze, that sometimes the loudest statements aren't made with words, but with grace. Anderson shifted slightly in his seat, his tie adjusting in a small but deliberate movement. It was subtle, but it spoke volumes. He was recalibrating. He had expected to dominate the conversation, but Barron had already taken control. Barron wasn't finished. "You sit here," he gestured around the studio, his fingers brushing the desk as he made his point, "and talk about my mother's lack of action. But let me ask you, Anderson, what action would have satisfied you? What words would have made you happy? Would you have preferred her to shout back, to attack, to fight fire with fire? Would that have been more palatable for you? Anderson opened his mouth as if ready to respond, but Barron cut him off before he had the chance. Or is it that no matter what she did, it would never have been enough? Barron's voice had taken on a quiet intensity now, not loud, but sharp enough to slice through the tension in the room. The truth is, you never wanted to understand her. You only wanted to fit her into a story that suited your narrative. A murmur rippled through the audience, and even the crew behind the cameras seemed to feel the weight at the moment. Anderson inhaled deeply, visibly recalibrating his approach, but Barron wasn't finished. "My mother taught me something when I was young," he said, sitting back in his chair, his posture as unyielding as before. "She told me that people will always try to define you. They'll try to tell you who you are before you even figure it out for yourself. But their words don't shape you, you do." The room fell silent once again. Barron's words had shattered the carefully constructed image that Anderson, and by extension the media, had spent years building. It wasn't just a defense of Melania. It was a defiant statement about the nature of public scrutiny and the power of silence. For the first time in the interview, Anderson Cooper was caught off guard. His usual unflappable composure wavered for a brief moment, just enough for the audience to notice. Barron Trump had not only responded, but he had taken control of the narrative, turning the conversation on its head. The power dynamics had shifted, and Anderson, usually the one in charge, now found himself at a loss for words. Anderson cleared his throat, shifting again in his chair. "Barron," he began, his voice more measured than before, "I respect your perspective, but let's be honest. When you're in the public eye, scrutiny is inevitable. Your mother took on the role of First Lady. With that comes responsibility, visibility, and yes, criticism." But Barron didn't flinch. He didn't back down. His voice remained as calm as ever, but with an edge that made every word cut deeper. "Criticism is one thing, Anderson," he replied. "But what you and others have done is not criticism, it's a narrative. You're not just pointing out flaws, you're shaping a story that fits your own version of things. And that I won't allow." The words echoed through the studio, leaving Anderson Cooper and the entire room to pause, to reflect on the weight of Barron Trump's silence and the power behind his words. The young man who had spent so long in the shadows had just stepped into the light, and in doing so had proven that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be defined by others' ridicule. Mockery. Turning her into a punchline just because she didn't fit the mold you expected. That's not scrutiny. Barron Trump's voice was calm but filled with undeniable conviction. That's personal. The room seemed to freeze. Anderson Cooper inhaled sharply, his instincts as a seasoned journalist kicking in. He had expected this conversation to unfold in his favor, to maintain control over the narrative, but Barron had just shifted the playing field. He leaned forward, a flicker of urgency in his gaze. "You're saying the media was unfair to her?" Anderson asked, trying to regain his footing. Barron gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, the corners of his lips curling up slightly. "I'm saying the media was never interested in being fair to her," he said. His words landed with precision, the weight of them sinking into the studio like stones in still water. A murmur rippled through the audience, as if they were waking from a collective trance. Anderson's mind raced. This wasn't how he'd expected this interview to go. He had set out to push Barron into uncomfortable corners, to dissect the Trump family legacy, but now Barron was the one making the sharp, direct jabs. And Anderson knew he needed to regain control. Yet Barron wasn't done. "She was mocked for her accent," Barron continued, his tone sharp and deliberate, his gaze unwavering. "Tell me, Anderson, would that same ridicule have been acceptable if she were any other immigrant woman, or was it fair game because of her last name?" Anderson hesitated, his mouth open, then closed as he struggled to form a response. Barron's words had pierced through the layers of his carefully constructed argument, and for a brief moment, Anderson was caught off guard. Barron wasn't waiting for an answer. "She was mocked for being quiet," he went on, his voice calm but carrying a distinct edge. "But when she did speak, when she took on cyberbullying as her initiative, she was mocked for that too. And why? Because people wanted to believe that someone in her position couldn't possibly have depth, couldn't possibly care, couldn't possibly be more than just a pretty face. Anderson exhaled, feeling the shift in power. He was used to being the one in control, the one guiding the conversation, weaving a narrative, but Barron was no longer following his lead. Barron was shaping the narrative, and the audience was hanging on his every word. "Look, Barron," Anderson said finally, adopting a gentler tone as he tried to reclaim some ground, "I hear what you're saying, but don't you think part of the responsibility of public figures, especially in politics, is to be held accountable, to be challenged?" Barron nodded, his expression as calm as ever, but there was an unmistakable strength in his words. "Absolutely," he said, "but accountability isn't the same as humiliation, and if we're being honest, my mother was never given the benefit of the doubt. Ever. She was never treated as a complex individual. She was only seen as a convenient target." A ripple of tension coursed through the studio as the once one-sided debate began to morph into something entirely different. Anderson Cooper, one of the most respected and well-known interviewers in the country, was no longer controlling the conversation. Barron had turned the spotlight onto the media itself, forcing Anderson and everyone in the room to reckon with the very nature of public scrutiny. The studio was silent, heavier than before. It wasn't the usual pause for dramatic effect, the kind of silence that punctuated an expertly crafted argument. This silence was raw, unfiltered, and filled with the weight of what had just unfolded. Barron Trump sat across from Anderson, his expression calm but resolute. For the first time in the interview, Anderson was unsure of his next move. The control he had held so effortlessly up until now was slipping through his fingers, and in its place was an uncomfortable truth. Barron Trump wasn't just another interviewee. He wasn't just the son of a former president. He was a force to be reckoned with in his own right. Anderson cleared his throat, trying to shake off the moment of vulnerability, but Barron, unflinching, didn't give him the space to regain control. "For years, the media has defined my mother," Barron continued, his voice steady and strong. "But they've never taken the time to understand her, to see her as a person with her own struggles, her own triumphs. They've always chosen to see her through a lens that suited their narrative. And that's not fairness. That's manipulation." The audience, who had once been quiet and passive, now seemed to hold their breath. Barron's words had created a shift, one so powerful that even the seasoned crew behind the cameras seemed to feel the weight of it. Anderson Cooper, the master of interviews, was no longer the one holding the upper hand. Barron Trump had walked into this interview as the quiet, enigmatic son of a former president, someone the media had always overlooked or underestimated. But now he was leaving as something entirely different, not just a shadow in his family's legacy, but a man who had taken control of the conversation, who had exposed the media's biases, and who had shown the world that silence was sometimes the loudest form of resistance. Barron Trump had done what no one had expected. He wasn't just a quiet, elusive figure the media had speculated about for years. No, tonight he had become something far more powerful, a voice no one had seen coming. Anderson Cooper, visibly rattled for the first time in the interview, cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. His usual calm demeanor slipped just slightly as he nodded in Barron's direction. "Well, Barron," Anderson said, choosing his words carefully, "I think you've certainly given people something to think about." It was a polite concession, a way of acknowledging that despite all the sharp jabs Anderson had thrown, Barron had not only weathered them, but had returned each one with precision. The audience, once expectant of Barron's discomfort, now sat in stunned silence, caught between disbelief and awe. What had started as another public critique of the Trump legacy, another takedown of a family figure, had transformed into something much deeper. The debate had forced a conversation not just about politics or public life, but about grace, dignity, and what it truly meant to have strength in a world that often confuses power with noise. As the cameras prepared to cut, Anderson extended his hand, a small but significant gesture. It was an attempt to close the interview with the usual formality, a sign of respect. Barron met it, shaking it firmly, but there was no act of submission in his gesture. Instead, it was one of quiet victory. He had entered the lion's den as a mere guest, but now he was leaving as someone who had shifted the narrative, someone who had taken control of the conversation. The show would air and the headlines would explode. Some would hail Barron as a formidable new voice in the public sphere. Others would twist his words into controversy, desperate to turn his clarity into something divisive. But no matter which side of the debate people stood on, one thing was undeniable. Barron Trump had spoken, and the world had no choice but to listen. The story of Barron Trump's interview with Anderson Cooper reveals powerful messages about silence, strength, and resilience. One key lesson is that silence is not a weakness, but a deliberate strategy, a form of resistance against a noisy world that often demands conformity. Barron's calm defense of his mother, Melania, teaches us that true strength lies in composure and conviction, not in loudness or aggression. This challenges society's tendency to equate power with volume, suggesting that dignity and patience can leave a deeper impact. Another vital takeaway is the importance of resisting external definitions. Barron's refusal to let the media define his mother or himself underscores the value of self-determination. In life, we can apply these lessons by embracing silence as a tool for reflection and strength, especially when faced with criticism or pressure to fit a mold. Instead of reacting impulsively, we can choose grace and purpose, standing firm in our values. The story also reminds us to see beyond surface judgments, recognizing the complexity in others. By redefining strength on our own terms, we cultivate resilience and authenticity, navigating life's challenges with quiet confidence rather than succumbing to the chaos around us. So, what do you think about the value of silence and true strength in today's world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want more intriguing content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and share it with your friends. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.